At the Buck Institute in the heart of Northern California, discoveries are being made that will change the way we age. Dr. Pankaj Kapahi's research is exploring how flies could lead us to aging better and healthier.
This is the fly room.
Méline, the founder of the Humanware Project, is here to discover more.
Why do you choose fruit flies?
It allows us to rapidly discover therapies and genes for aging and age-related diseases. 70 to 80% of the human disease genes, you can find similar genes to that in the fly. We did one experiment and we were able to extend the lifespan by 5 times in that model. Yeah. Studies have shown that if people who are diabetics go over to raw food, that actually can reduce the risk of diabetes, can even reverse it. You can study many complex behaviors like circadian rhythm, sleep, memory, infection responses, immune function. 4 Nobel Prizes have been given to work that started in the flies. One of the things we've found, for example, in fruit flies is not everyone is going to get the same benefits. So let me show you an experiment. These flies have been on dietary restriction and these flies have been on a rich diet. I'm going to knock them down. You can see which one comes up first. These are the flies on the dietary restriction now. And you'll see, look how quickly they're going to go up.
Ooh, a lot quicker.
If you had puberty before 11 and a childbirth before 2021, guess how much you increase your diabetes risk?
10%?
400 times.
400 times.
We express a protein in the brain which causes dementia in us, and the same thing causes degeneration in the flies. And that's what we can treat by either diet restriction or drugs.
It's crazy.
Studying science is the one way I can serve society. It's what gave me a lot of happiness.
Hi Pankaj, welcome to the Humanware Project. So happy to have you today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
The first time when I come across your work, it's actually come from one of your colleagues. She mentions you have a study talking about when we cook the meat, the caramelized part of the meat is actually not so good for our health. When I hear that, I was like, oh, I wish I didn't know that. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely. Studies have shown that if people who are diabetics go over to raw food, that actually can reduce the risk of diabetes, can even reverse it. There's 2 parts to that. One, when you eat cooked food, it's tastier, so you end up eating more calories. Secondly, we think the cooking itself produces in the food what are called advanced glycation end products. So it's the reaction of sugars with amino acids, and the combination of that produces these advanced glycation end products, which we are finding can increase food intake, increase inflammation, increase the risk of death, essentially. For example, if you made a toast this morning, a few minutes of cooking bread produces 50 new advanced glycation end products. And that's what makes the toast so tasty. And we've found that even in worms and in mice, when you feed those ages, the animal tends to eat more.
That's just crazy. It's one of those information I'm glad I know, but at the same time, I kind of wish I can just eat with ignorance so that I wouldn't think so much in my head. Clearly, you are expert on diet, on metabolism, and also aging. Could you tell us, actually start with, if we think about ultimate health diet, what it will look like for you?
I want to also say I'm not a popular person at parties. All this knowledge, it doesn't work in my favor. But the optimal diet, I think, best way to think about it is a stoic way of living. The simpler it is, the better it is. If you can eat whole foods, if you can avoid any extracted things like sugar, oil, and processed food, I think the number one thing I would optimize in our diet would be fiber. If you ensure that your fiber intake is right, then you change a lot of things. For example, starting with the microbiome, right? If you have good fiber, then the right type of bacteria are in your gut. And not only that, the fiber is also very, very good at mitigating the free sugars, essentially. So your sugars don't spike if you have good fiber in your body. So I think we have to think of things the opposite way. Less broad, like, a lot of the food that you see in the supermarket, I feel it's an experiment being done on us to see what we pick, what are we most tempted to pick, and what benefits, what increases sales. But unfortunately, those things, the way we're wired, is that we go for things that aren't necessarily good for you in the long term. So what's interesting is these ages and these rich diets may be good for you in the long term in terms of ensuring our reproductive success. But they're not good for you in terms of long-term effects of on aging.
If we dive deep into a whole day's diet routines, what do you think would be a great time to wake up in general? Of course, everybody's different, but is there any kind of suggestions how much protein we need to have, how much fiber we need to have, what kind of time we need to have certain things?
There are two key parts. One is the total calorie intake and the timing of your food intake. And studies are showing both are important. And I would argue the total calories is very important. It has to be the Japanese dictum of eating till you're 80% full. That's a very good principle to live by. Don't eat till you're full. And in terms of diet, we discussed that in terms of composition of the diet, it's important to prioritize fiber. Now on protein, I want to say there's a lot of divided opinion. A lot of people who want to, improve their muscle mass, they would argue more protein is good. But what is also very interesting to realize is more protein is also linked with shortening of lifespan in invertebrate models and mice as well. So one question which a lot of people don't address is what are the long-term effects of having a high protein diet? More studies have shown that that's actually detrimental. So yes, it may help you in your muscle mass, but the question we don't ask often is what about muscle quality? What about the way the muscle ages? And studies show that actually when you're dietarily restricted or on the lower protein side, your muscle quality actually improves.
Oh, right.
So fiber and in terms of sugar, I think carbohydrates, the best thing would be to avoid any kind of processed food and low sugars altogether.
So if you could, will you recommend anyone to eat sugar at all? Just cut it completely for good? Or occasionally have some?
Think about this in evolutionary terms. We evolved under conditions of low food, right, and famine and feast. So there it was an advantage to be able to eat more because you were not sure whether you're going to get your next meal or not, right? So that's an advantage to be able to take in more food and store more food. Now we're facing a condition of excess food, right? So the problem is now you can eat sushi 3 times a day. But in those conditions, this sort of insurance mechanism that's hardwired in us, which is to eat more, we need to dampen that down. So we need to use tricks to fool us that we've eaten more or actively avoid food. So that's why I think fiber becomes very important to optimize. If you eat more fiber first, then you end up eating overall lesser calories as well. And the second part to all this is the timing. I find intermittent fasting very effective because one reason I like it is once you've started eating, it's hard to stop, right? It's easier to convince yourself to delay eating your breakfast, for example. So then if you cut it down to, let's say, 2 meals a day, it's easier to consume fewer calories. And studies have shown timing is also important. So even if you cut down calories, but if you're eating it multiple times, the studies show in mice that that's detrimental to their health. So you want to limit to fewer number of meals a day. Again, this is a device that's not been given traditionally, but studies are showing that is a better way to optimize your health. Now, I want to say, I do intermittent fasting, and when you switch, let's say, to a 16-hour which is what I do, 16-hour fast. Initially, it can be a challenge and you can also get headaches, but I think your body gets used to it. I kind of think of it as training for marathon, right? Initially, it's harder and you can start by doing 12-hour fasting and then go slowly to 14 hours and then move to 16 hours. And it's not for everyone. Everyone responds differently to it as well. But if it's for you, then you might find that going to it gradually is a better way to sort of move over to an intermittent fasting period. Studies show that you want to eat your meal maybe in the early part of the day. That's practically hard, so I try to do more what's called a 7-11. I eat my last meal around 7 and then try to eat breakfast around 11.
Yeah, actually, when you talk about when we first start any form of fasting, we'll experience either headache or very uncomfort. Why we will have headache at that time? Like what happened to our body?
So I think multiple things are happening. One of the things that is happening is what's similar to exercise is when you're fasting and in exercise, one of the key things that happens is you learn to access your fat better, right? Because in the period of starvation, you start using triglycerides of fat. If we are used to eating multiple meals a day, then you're just using sugar. You're not breaking down the fat. So there's a change in metabolism, which takes some time. The body needs to get used to it. Same thing you would do if you are going to practice run. You can't run a marathon without any training, right? So it's the same way I like to think it's good to do it in steps and build your, train yourself for it. One of the things I also recommend as a habit, don't start and stop, build up gradually, but do it for 3-4 weeks, and then you'll start seeing it becomes easier and easier to do.
Yeah, because when it comes to fasting, luckily, not only we have abundance of food, we have abundance of information as well. That's why our channel is really keen on finding the best expert on what they study to really give an obstacle, like a filter, like what is the right diet, what is not. Because when we hear about that, there has carnivore diet, there has juice diet, there has celery diet, so many kind of diet, or they tell you don't eat anything, just drink water. So could you give us a little bit insight? What are the good diet for certain people?
So I think you're right. There's a lot of fads, and along with that comes new diets. But I'd say the most data we have is for Mediterranean type of diet. And I would add to that, I think one of the key things with all this diet control is to do something that is sustainable, that works for you. Studies have shown that we have huge individual differences. Not everyone responds to a banana the same way, for example, right? So it's important to work out what works for you and do something that's sustainable. There's no point going on a diet for a few months and then going off it and so have a sort of yo-yo effect. So I think it's good to find practices that you can slowly build into your lifestyle and keep it going on for longer. And the other thing I think I like to point out, if you feel you're pushing yourself too much, then it's not quite working. It should be easier to doing. One of the beauties of doing intermittent fasting is you're not just getting long-term effects. You actually get short-term effects as well. One of the immediate benefits of fasting are increased alertness, right? So if you enjoy the satisfaction out of that, improved memory, improved motivation for physical activity. These are all some of the benefits of dietary restriction which have been seen across species. So if you optimize for sort of your general health benefits, that's a good way to go. One of the things we've found, for example, in fruit flies is not everyone is going to get the same benefits. Not everyone may optimize, for example, their physical activity or extend their lifespan. But there are multiple effects of diet restriction. Overall, it's good, but you may not all get the same kind of benefits. For example, there's profound effects on gut health.
Right.
One of the things we've found that has been really exciting is that you improve your rhythmicity, your circadian phenotype. So for example, every cell has a clock. Estimates argue about 70% of our genes are rhythmic. Now, we found that, along with other groups, that if you eat less, you enhance the amplitude of the circadian gene expression.
What would that mean?
That would mean that, for example, your body goes through anabolism and catabolism, right? So during the day, you're eating nutrients and they get stored, and at nighttime you break them, right? So let's take fatty acid breakdown. So you have to synthesize fat and break down fat. What we found was that if you eat less, the amplitude, that means those genes that are important for synthesis and breakdown, change a lot more. And we find that this increase in amplitude is beneficial for the body. It's its own biomarker of aging. If your rhythmicity of gene expression of the metabolic changes is higher, that indicates a more robust, healthy phenotype.
Oh, that's so interesting. So can we actually make us age slower? Let's say if two people, same age, if we are eating differently, are we going to age differently?
Absolutely. The data in humans, there's not as much data for aging, but a lot of this data exists in invertebrate animals, shows quite strongly that this is tied in with improvement of circadian gene expression. And if you remove those genes that are important for circadian clocks, you don't get the benefits of dietary restriction. So we think they accompany the benefits of dietary restriction. In humans, I think there's a lot of good data on improvement of insulin sensitivity and fat reduction. For example, intermittent fasting has been shown to be very good for if your goal is to reduce overall fat or overall weight.
Because I know you are quite an expert on fruit fly study. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because that's very refreshing to see what you can learn from fruit flies and how does that relate to human.
One of our recent studies that's coming out, we found benefits for multiple tissues. We've shown improvement of, for example, fat recycling. We've shown that there's an improvement in gut health and reduces intestinal permeability. Also seen in terms of muscle that it improves physical activity. And if the animal is not active under dietary restriction, it doesn't get the maximal benefits of dietary restriction. So we think it's important to also have increased activity. Now what we've been focusing recently on more is how does it impact brain health? And what's interesting is there are different mechanisms for different tissues, right? So one of the cool things we have just recently learned is that dietary restriction also delays the risk of tauopathy, which is a type of dementia, which is something you see in Alzheimer's disease. We've shown that in these conditions of dementia and also in the rich diet conditions when you overeat, your brain accumulates, in the neurons, you accumulate glycogen, which is essentially a way to store glucose. What we're finding is your catabolic processes, which means breaking down of macromolecules, is not as efficient in tauopathy and in conditions when you eat a lot. So we think this balance between breakdown and synthesis is very critical for optimal health. So when you are on dietary restriction, you're training your body to break down to get fat, to reduce the brain glycogen. Right, so this is the new thing we found, is that if you break down glycogen in the brain, that can protect against neurodegenerative diseases and also be beneficial in terms of brain health.
So could you tell us a little bit more on your study on anti-aging and aging and also TOR? Because I know your lab or yourself is the leading expert on finding rapamycin to be one of those anti-aging drugs. Could you take a step deep into that?
Yeah, this was work I did when I was a postdoc. It was a long time back. One of the things I think to understand is that processes that are good for development and growth, or that cause rapid growth and development, can be detrimental for long-term health. So TOR is one such pathway. TOR is a nutrient sensor which connects nutrients in the environment to growth of a cell. So if you have a mutation in TOR, it's an anti-cancer mechanism. It actually reduces the size of the animal, right? So we were one of the first labs to conduct experiments. Our hypothesis was, well, if this can slow growth during development and early on in life, maybe it has benefits later on in life. And that's exactly what we found, that if you inhibited TOR either early or late in life, it extended lifespan.
So is that the same thing you are talking about when a woman, they go through puberty a little bit early, they can be aging a little bit faster when they're later? Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, so then following on this idea of antagonistic plytropy, which means genes that are beneficial during growth and development can be detrimental later on, we've done recently a study where we looked at genetic variation that increases age of puberty or age at first birth in women. And so there are 500 SNPs found for these traits. And we've identified, generally what we're seeing is that if you have early pregnancy and early puberty, that accelerates the aging process. Risk of age-related diseases like heart disease, obesity, diabetes. For example, if you had puberty before 11 and a childbirth before 2021, guess how much you increase your diabetes risk?
10%, 20%?
We found a 4-fold increase in diabetes and obesity risk.
400 times.
Yeah. So we think those early life events have a very important effect on things that happen later in life that set the stage for how you're going to age. So it's very important to also think about what events happen early in life. For example, I think this is important for public health to think about. It's not just important in terms of when you give birth for the child, but also for the mother. It looks like there's an optimal window in which they should give birth for the least sort of effects later on in life in terms of diseases.
With the science and data we know as for today, is there any suggestions on what kind of windows will be good for women to conceive a baby to prolong their aging?
That's a great question. I think it would have to be looked at more carefully, but our analysis on the data from the UK Biobank showed that I think in the period around 30 years of age, that is more of a sweet spot where we found the least amount of risk of age-related diseases. And some diseases were even slowed if the birth was later, but I think around in that range is a good, yeah.
Wow, that is very shocking to know, because in my mind, in my common sense, I always imagine if you having a baby give birth earlier, then you can balance back faster. Is there a fact for that?
There's a lot that is happening, and it may be true but we were looking at long-term effects like what's happening much later in life. This is what the data shows. But I think we need to look into this question more deeply and in more different populations to ask this question more carefully. Yeah.
So just to explain so that I could understand, when we talk about TOR, is that means if we suppress it in the early stages of our life so that it doesn't be as active, so that we probably prolong how slow we aging, because it's just like the similar effect as the women who go through their puberty a little bit later stage in life.
Yeah.
Is that means we have an expiry date for ourselves, for our health in a sense?
Yeah, I think it's a concern because nowadays we're finding that age of puberty is actually coming earlier and earlier. It's because of, again, access to abundant food, which is the key driver. But it's not just TOR, it's TOR, insulin signaling, growth hormone. All these pathways together are important for early growth and early fitness, but they can be detrimental later on if they're activated too early or they go too high.
Oh, so it's actually good to learn. Maybe it's not always good you grow too fast sometimes.
Right. That's what some of our work is showing, yeah. I think it needs to be looked into more carefully, yeah.
I think recently there have quite a lot of anti-aging drugs. Could you name us a few? And do you have any comments on those anti-aging drugs? For example, rapamycin, like you are famous and known for.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good preclinical data with rapamycin. One of the questions is, can we take this at a low dose for it to be effective in humans? And I think there are clinical trials being done on this. So I'm optimistic that some of these things might work. We have to wait and see to see if those things would work. Another thing we are working on is how to reduce glycation. We're trying to understand why is sugar toxic. So our hypothesis is that sugar is detrimental not because of the levels of glucose, but actually what glucose does to the cell. And that is formation of advanced glycation end products. So the byproducts of sugar metabolism is to create compounds which are way more reactive, like methyl glyoxal. And these react with amino acids and produce advanced glycation end products. Now, these we think are driving the pathology. So we have created a combination supplement, for example, because we wanted to use something that was safe and used in humans already. And using this approach, we have found that a combination supplement actually reduces glycation in mice and will also extend lifespan. And we're finding widespread benefits on slowing heart disease, eye aging, ovarian aging, and extending lifespan, and improving muscle mass. So it's a very unique approach because glycation is also bad for muscle mass. So we're finding that it also reduces your food intake, but it preserves muscle mass.
Because there have different form of sugar, right? The sugar in pasta, the sugar in pure dessert form, or the sugar in fruit. Is there any good sugar at all, or they're all bad?
Yeah, I think we're working on different forms of sugar, so it's too early to say, but we think not all sugars are the same, but glucose and fructose are definitely detrimental.
And when we think about the calorie intake every day and throughout our age, maybe when we're younger, when we're more active, we have more strong metabolism. When we're getting older, it could get slowed down. Could you give us an insight, what is metabolism and how that's been changed throughout our life?
Very good question. Like I said, what we're finding is that when you're younger, the cycles of anabolism and catabolism, that's by synthesis of macromolecules and breakdown of molecules, they work very efficiently. These are circadian processes, right? At nighttime you break down food, during the daytime you synthesize these macromolecules. So we're finding that this declines with age, including our sleep also declines with age. So our ability to maintain homeostasis is declining with age. And one way to, and I'd say still the most robust way to keep that on track is by eating less, because that just puts less stress on the body overall. It keeps the body training, just like exercise, to process things more efficiently.
Oh, and also I know since 2016 your work is deeply focused on circadian rhythms. Could you tell us what it is and why that's important for our health?
Yeah, circadian rhythms are those that happen once in 24 hours, right? So what we're finding is that over 70% of the genes in the cells are believed to be circadian. All cells have their own clock, because each cell has to do a different thing during the day and at night, so that we're in sync with our environment, right? And what we're learning is that it's not just light that plays a role in optimizing our circadian rhythm, but food plays a big role. And the timing of the food is a big role. For example, at nighttime you do all the repair functions. So now just imagine at nighttime you do repair functions and you just ate a big meal before going to sleep, right? Right when your body was getting into repair stage, you eat a big meal. The body just got a signal to wake up, right? So now it has to deal with all that. The gut has to work, the liver has to work, all the organs have to work to deal with this big meal. That's why it's harder to sleep if you've had a big meal closer to bed, right? That's why the suggestion is to eat 3-4 hours before your sleep time. To maintain this circadian rhythms, what we're finding surprisingly is that if you eat less, it seems to boost the what we call the amplitude of the circadian rhythms, which means you look at the changes in a gene over time in a day, right? So normally, let's say there's a shallow amplitude, but if you are on diet restriction, you can see that it improves.
Okay.
Yeah, and that we think is a biomarker for aging, that to have greater amplitude of gene expression in a circadian manner will boost your health further.
Trying to figure out, is our all different cells in our body, they all have a different clock, or different cells actually working on obey different clocks? And are they really 24 hours like cycle, or there has different cycles?
When you put an animal completely in dark, studies have shown that it's not exactly a 24-hour cycle, but because we are responding to light, you can keep it on a 24-hour cycle. I mean, I think there's not been a good study on this, but one of the things you see in people who live really long, this is anecdotal, but I found they adhere to a strict schedule naturally. When they eat, when they do certain things, there's a cadence to it. And I think that is another way to kind of interesting habit to inculcate, to keep things, do things in a sort of routine manner so that the body has to face less fluctuations and gets used to a certain rhythm.
What will happen to the people when they don't expose to the light? For example, the people who are in the north, like maybe in the winter, they have really few light exposures, or the people who always in the sunlight spot. Are those going to influence their aging and the health?
Incidentally, we did a study on this in flies. And to our surprise, we found that flies that were kept in constant darkness lived longer. But we don't know if this will translate to humans, but light causes a lot of damage. And one idea is that the circadian clocks evolved so that we can avoid the damage due to light. So damage takes place to the skin, significant damage takes place to your eyes. And what we have found is that circadian factors are very important in protecting the eyes from damage, and the damage in the eyes can even affect other tissues, increase inflammation in the body. These kind of studies have not quite been done. There are of course, known effects on, for example, depression of being in constant dark. We don't know what will happen in humans, but I think there's multiple factors at play here. For now, what we understand is best to maybe keep your rhythms more consistent so that you're optimizing your sleep. The circadian clocks are working in a homeostatic fashion to do your daily functions of like metabolizing food and being active. So the best thing for now, we understand, is to just keep things going in a rhythmic fashion.
So the goal for this is actually I want my body to function into a cycle that is quite consistency.
Right.
Is that?
Right.
But then nowadays we are exposed to a lot of blue light, a lot
Right.
of screens. Even in the morning when we wake up, and sometimes there has no light, and I heard people have using those true light lamp
Yeah.
for them to waking up. So what is your point of view on those lights around us? And if we could design our day to peak performance, how many hours should I sleep? And then how I should design the light exposure around me to make sure that I aging well?
I mean, I always like to think how things were thousands of years ago. And I think there wasn't artificial light. So our body is not really meant to deal with artificial light. And we are now facing, amongst other types of pollution, something we don't talk about, light pollution, right? It's a big factor in accelerating our, I guess, demise of the circadian function and sleep. A lot of studies are out there on that. So the best way would be to go more to, what would be more natural, like I said, sleep earlier. I try to my best to put my kids to sleep as early as I can. And that's actually helped me also maintain my circadian hour, because I try to go to sleep right after them as well, and kind of waking up more. So I was more a night person before, but I found it's not that hard to change, and I now wake up earlier in the morning and try to go to sleep early at night.
I do feel you, because I think normally I'm a night person, but sometimes when I start to wake up early and sleep early, it definitely feel a lot difference physically and mood-wise. Just trying to think, like, when we want to start a very productive day, so if we sleep good, we eat good, and we try to increase the fiber in our diet, what are the other things we could do to make us living or feeling healthier?
Different things work for different people, and there are definitely circadian differences between us. So there are going to be some people who are more active at different times of the day. But I think starting off your day right is very important. I try to drink lots of water when I wake up. And I think I one of the practices I've started, which I enjoy, is journaling in the morning. 10-15 minutes. If you get your thoughts together, I feel it changes the way, it's a kind of like meditation. For me, journaling works. It changes how I approach the day. And then I think having some physical activity in midday or before dinner is another thing to include in your daily activity. And like that food we discussed, trying to delay the first meal to 11-12 is one way to do it. Like the point is to first meal and last meal within an 8 to 10 hour window.
As you mentioned, our circadian rhythm is different. Is there a way to measure it, or is there any tools or data collection things we can do to understand what it is personally to me?
Yeah, I think one of the things which you can see, I saw this when I was doing intermittent fasting, your alertness changes. We found that even the eye function improves with intermittent fasting in flies, and I think you can start seeing differences on your gut health and physical activity. Those are important because that's a good way to measure your own function activity. We're actually doing a clinical trial which is going to be quite exciting. For example, a lot of measures that are taken without taking into account the time of the day. And we think it's very important to think about the time of the day, because hormones are fluctuating during the day. A lot of, like I said, the repair genes happen at night. So it's very important to think when you're getting these measurements. So we're about to undertake this study at the Buck, where we will be taking a lot of measures from the blood samples and behavior at different times of the day to answer this question: what is the role of the circadian changes in these factors, and whether the circadian changes could itself be a biomarker of health, and like what are the best times of the day to look at different biomarkers.
No, but then what happened to the people who travels a lot? Let's say if they travel every other week to a different time zone.
So I think the best data we have, I'd say the most, in some ways, very convincing data is that people who are shift workers don't do well in terms of their mortality and also their age-related diseases. Data shows that it's not good for your health, long-term health. If you take something from that, it would argue that shifting time zones continuously is not going to be good. And we see this in animals. Shifting their time zones or their food and sleep cycles is a big stress on the animal, for which it takes a while to recover. My wife is a doctor, and I find it ludicrous that doctors who are treating us, they're expected to be up at night for such long hours of time, because enough studies show that impairs your judgment. So we should be finding ways to put less circadian stress on people around, so that you can get the most out of their health and their productivity. Yeah.
I definitely feel one of the things, information and also knowledge is power, because if we do understand when we will go through a peak performance, we can simply put the most important work in the moment we feel the best at ourselves.
Yeah, so in terms of concentration, early in the morning, around 10 is when you're supposed to have your best ability to concentrate. Yeah. But like that, there are different things. I think your peak physical performance comes a little later in the day. Yeah.
I do know, like, throughout your career, you have published a lot of very well-known papers. Could you walk us through a few of your very, proud or very interesting work to share with our audience? What are the findings inside those papers and what our audience may not know?
We covered quite a few. So one of the main areas in the lab is understanding the mechanisms of diet restriction. So like I said, we were one of the first labs to identify that inhibition of TOR extends lifespan, and that may be overlapping with the effects of diet restriction. We have done multiple studies to show how diet restriction improves health span and lifespan, and the fact that they're not always connected. You can have extended health span but not lifespan, and vice versa. And we see improvements in eye function, improvements in gut function, improvements in physical activity and fat metabolism. Recently, we've published a few papers on improvement in brain function with diet restriction. And like I said, we think there are different mechanisms at play for each of these different tissues.
Because you have mentioned the eye function a lot, I think that is something that we probably wouldn't consider. Eye function is actually relatively important for our health and longevity. Could you give us some detail on that?
Yeah, I think it was a surprising finding when we looked at gene expression that changed upon diet restriction in a whole fly. We kept seeing genes important for vision to be upregulated. Then we looked deeper, we found that dietary restriction essentially slows the aging of the eye. And which makes a lot of sense, because imagine in the wild, if you are lacking food, you want to improve your memory, you want to improve your vision to be able to find the food, and you want to be physically more active. And so we think the benefits of diet restriction are a byproduct of the hunger response, which is to make you better at finding food. So I think the lesson is to stay hungry. If you're hungry, like in any other thing in life, then you're more likely to perform optimally, and that's what we are seeing. Going back to the different areas in the lab, the second, another major area in the lab that we are involved in is understanding why sugar is toxic. And there we've been studying how glycation is a major driver of aging and in diabetic complications, and ways to mitigate glycation. One of them is by eating less, but we're trying to find direct downstream ways to sort of mitigate glycation, which seems to improve health span.
Before I listen to this episode, I already eating quite a lot of sugar. Is there a way that I get rid of those bad toxins in me to balance back to my peak performance?
What we have found is that there are natural pathways that detoxify the toxic byproducts of sugar metabolism. So we've identified compounds that can limit that toxic damage. So we're doing clinical trial on this as well, that compounds that reduce glycation can improve your health and also help improve fatty acid catabolism, improve muscle function, like I said, eye and heart function. So we think this can be used in conjunction with other lifestyle changes like exercise, proper sleep, to improve your health.
Since today we are in Bach Institute, it's definitely the most advanced longevity research and anti-aging research center. Is there anything you think is very interesting to share to our audience?
One of the cool things of working at the Bach is that there are a number of us, 18 faculty, involved in asking questions around aging, but each one of us is asking it in a different way, but we have a common mission. It's a great way to approach the problem because we are looking at it slightly differently, but we come together to write a lot of our papers. So there's a lot of synergy in the way we are approaching the problem, and I think there are a lot of new things, surprising things that are happening, which we'll see in the next few years.
Actually, would love to understand in the end, Pankaj, what's driving you to start this study at the beginning?
Studying science is the one way I can serve society. It's what gave me a lot of happiness to figure out, to discover new things. And I chose aging because at that time, not many people were working on aging, and it seemed to be a very complex problem to study. And also, you'd think, why should you lose your loved ones early on? If there are ways to slow down aging, why not, right? And I think when I was 18 or 19, when I first came across studies on diet restriction, I walked around thinking, wow, I have a very special knowledge. Just imagine if you have a way that can give you another extra 10 years or more of healthy life, why wouldn't you take it? So I think that despite this knowledge, what's very surprising, and despite our increased understanding and awareness of this knowledge, if you look at the direction of the world, more and more people are becoming overweight and obese. So it's very counterintuitive. On one hand, we're increasing our knowledge, but on the other hand, we are not the society as a whole is not improving, which tells you what a challenging problem this is. It's because we're hardwired like any animal in the zoo. You don't want to feed it because they overeat. I think it's the same way we're hardwired to overeat, and the market forces around us are such that there's just more food around us than we need. I think this awareness, what you're doing is very important, because I think heightened awareness can help us become better as a society, because I think it's the way, if you think about how we dealt with smoking, right? It is addictive. More and more people were suffering due to smoking. But I think it's amazing to see the change that's taken place in America, where, now there's a reduction in smoking, which helps the general. I think awareness is a big issue. And I think the same information awareness is needed around nutrition, so that there's effects both from the bottom up, but also at the level of public policy to incentivize people to have better health.
If the funding is limitless, right, what you will study on today?
I'm fascinated with the questions around longevity, and one of the very interesting untapped resources that we have, and I did my PhD on that, is to understand why do different species live differently, right? Why do they have different lifespans? A mouse lives only 2-3 years, and humans can live up to 100 or more years, right? So nature has done this experiment for us, where it's created the situation of different lifespans across species and adaptations to different situations. So I think tapping into that to understand how to optimize health and longevity, I think is a fascinating area. So I think this is something I'd love to get into more.
One last question. What is aging means for you, Pankaj?
I think we should have started with that. And everyone who talks about aging, I think it means something different for them. And that's one of the reasons I think there's a lot of disagreement in the field. What are you trying to optimize for when you're talking about aging? And I have to say, my view is shifted on this and is shifting on this. I now think it's very important to have a good mindset to live a full life. It's more important to have more life in your years than have more years in your life. So as I grow older, I think it's much more important to make the most of your time on earth. I find we are sometimes forgetting that when we are trying to optimize health. I like this Stoic principle, which is to live each day as if it's your last day. What is interesting about that sort of philosophy is that when you think like that, you bring a sort of urgency to your present moment. What I find which maybe sound counterintuitive, that when you live like that, that means you're busy living. That is actually a very good way to ensure you live longer, because you can't fool your body. If your muscles and brain, your neurons are not working, the body falls apart very quickly. So the best way to, I think, optimize your health is to use it as well as you can.
I really, really love this last comment, because it's really give meanings for our everyday life.
Yeah.
And really appreciate for your time today, Pankaj.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching this new episode of the Human Well Project. It will help us a lot to subscribe and like this video. Looking forward to see you soon.